Thank you for joining today's complimentary webinar from Value Selling Associates on using anxiety questions to finish the year strong. My name is Natalie Pitchford, and I am a managing partner with Value Selling Associates, and I will be taking you through our session today. As others are logging in, would you mind taking a moment to let me know where you're joining us from? You can enter your responses in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. As for me, I am joining you from Jamaica today, where, to quote the classic reggae song, it's 96 degrees in the shade and it feels like it. I see we have participants from various locations, so welcome to everyone. I think we've got good mornings and good afternoons based on the location, so thank you, and thank you for joining us. I have two things I'd like to say before we get started. Firstly, the session is being recorded and will be available on our website later today for download, so feel free to check our website in a couple of hours and you'll have access to the material. Secondly, I'll be happy to take any questions at the end of the session. So if you have them, go ahead and type them into that same Q&A box. And if I'm not able to answer your question or all questions at the end of the session, don't worry, I will follow up with a direct response to you. So with that, let's get started. Have you ever had one of these prospects? I call it the young godfather posture, where it's almost as if he's taunting you. I dare you to sell me something. But his arms may not be folded, but he has nothing inviting about him. And basically, you've done your prep, you've gone in, you've determined you're a good fit and that they're an ideal prospect for you. However, there's no response. And at this point, you're thinking, do I cut my losses and run like the wind, or do I quickly figure out a way to engage this prospect? And also, have you been in a situation where you've done, you think you're progressing very well, you've had numerous meetings with various stakeholders, you've been through the business issues that the customer is facing, you understand their problems, your solution is a good fit to help them resolve those problems, but you seem to be passed from one stakeholder to the next, and it just feels like you're running around in circles, and you're stuck in this vicious cycle of indecision. Again, do you cut your losses and move on, or do you make a deliberate decision to create a disruption to move things forward? Well, today we're going to be talking about how we can use anxiety questions to help us motivate our prospects to take action, and particularly as we're heading into the last segment of the year, and for us it's almost the last quarter of a fiscal year. How can we use anxiety questions and leverage them to move our opportunities forward to finish the year strong? So there are four key things we're going to be covering in our session today. The first is, what is an anxiety question? So we're going to spend some time defining what an anxiety question is. The next thing we're going to look at is, how do we create good anxiety questions that we can have in our arsenal for when we might need to pull them out to help us advance an opportunity? Thirdly, where are the best scenarios for using an anxiety questions? And we're going to look at three specific opportunities that are really well positioned for us to use anxiety questions. And the fourth thing we're going to cover today is, when we get to a section of our engagement with a customer where we go through that radio silence period, you think things are going well, and then all of a sudden, no response. No response to your emails, your meeting requests. What can we do to reduce that period and to keep our prospect engaged throughout the entire sales cycle? So we're going to talk about some specific things to do that. As we look at what an anxiety question is, one of the key things we're going to focus on is there are different question types that we have in our arsenal for use today. At Value Selling, one of the core things that we do is to equip salespersons with the skills to have purposeful conversations with their prospects to either unearth new opportunities or to advance a sale. And the key to having these types of conversations is knowing what types of questions to ask and when to use them. So we have a number of question types, as you can see here, and I'll quickly run through a few of them before we get into anxiety. The first question type that we have at our disposal is an open question. And this type of question is really designed to get the prospect to open up, share what's going on in their business. And, it's typically an open-ended question that says, can you tell me about the main challenges you're currently faced with today? The second question that we have in our arsenal is a probing question. And probing questions are really designed to raise issues that didn't surface on their own. So you want to go a bit deeper into understanding what's happening within that prospect's business. And they are also used to differentiate and create need for our products and services. So an example of a probing question could be, I see you're having an issue with customer attrition today. What are some of the main reasons why your customers may be looking to leave or are leaving today? Another question in our arsenal is a confirming question. And this is actually probably one of the most overlooked questions. And it really serves the purpose of ensuring that you've understood what the customer has said by playing back what you've heard. So, Mr. Customer, let me understand this, and play back what you've heard them say and ask for their confirmation. And this really ensures that you're both on the same page. And where we're going to be spending the bulk of our time in this webinar is around the area of anxiety questions. And anxiety questions are really aimed at getting that prospect or that customer to momentarily experience the consequences of not having your product or service. So what you're trying to do with an anxiety question is you're carefully wording a question to create some sort of urgency or to change the customer's perspective. So, for example, we have a customer who may not have thought of looking at a solution in a particular way or may not have considered our solution. And what we're doing is we're asking a carefully worded question to say, Mr. Customer, have you considered this? What is the impact of doing this? And we'll get into that in a bit more detail. So as we look at anxiety questions, one of the first things we want to define is, what is anxiety? And really, anxiety is a feeling of worry or nervousness. It's usually a feeling of fear or uneasiness about some imminent or uncertain outcome. So what we're trying to do with an anxiety question or the use of anxiety is to surface something that the prospect might not have considered and to insert some fear, uncertainty, or doubt into their thought process that might not be there today. What we're really trying to encourage them to do is see some sort of urgency as to why they want to move forward with us or do business with us or engage our services. One of the key things is that we don't want to cause panic. So as we talk about anxiety questions, we're going to talk about some specific scenarios as to how and when we use them, because we don't want to put ourselves in a confrontational situation, or we don't want to risk insulting the buyer as well. So we're going to talk about some ways how we use these questions very carefully and wisely at certain points in the sales cycle. We want to make sure that we can maintain the relationship with that customer while at the same time increasing the tension so that they can consider moving forward with our solution. So what does an anxiety question is really designed to cause an emotional response. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to evoke a response out of the customer that creates some motivation to move forward. Because when people have an emotional response, we're able to gauge more insight from them as to what's going on in their business, what's going on in their operations, and how we may be able to help them solve a particular issue. The crux of what we really want to do is open up an unexpected dialogue. We want to raise some issues that the customer may not have thought about and embark on a conversation that the prospect may not be expecting, but one that can help us, again, advance the sale. And at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is to shift the prospect's thinking, more purposely and productively towards a certain cause or towards a certain end that they can benefit from that they may not have been thinking about today. And we want to do so in a way that does not damage that relationship, but ensure that we can keep our rapport intact. So what does an anxiety question look like? They're usually usually used with words that create or evoke anxiety, such as, what happens if? What's the impact if you have not done this particular thing? Have you considered the consequences of not moving forward here? So, those are the types of words that really evoke anxiety. Are you concerned that this might happen if you don't do this today? Are you confident that you have the right structure in place to deliver X, Y, and Z on the goals that you may have? So when we're looking at how we create anxiety questions in a moment, these are some of the words that we're going to be using to really evoke that sense of anxiety in the customer and get their attention in a way that we want them to focus on moving forward. So the reason why we use anxiety questions is we're really trying, with some customers who are very confident or even keel, this may be the only way that they may respond to you, your product, or your service. An anxiety question, as we mentioned before, is really getting that prospect to experience consequences of not having your product or service. For example, if you're selling a software solution, one of the questions you might want to ask is, do you feel fairly confident that your current software can handle, the new employees you're going to be bringing on board in another month's time? So what that does is that causes the prospect to think of, hold on, do I have the right structure in place? Do I have the right software solution in place? So it really gets them to think about something that they may not be thinking about and experience the consequences of not having your product, what the consequences may be of not having your product or service. The other thing that you're trying to do with that anxiety question is to create an emotional impact or an emotional response from the buyer. At the end of the day, we want to provoke some new thinking in the mind of the buyer, so that we then can create some sense of motivation to act in a way that will enable us to move the sale forward. What this also means is that we need to understand what motivates that buyer. And at the end of the day, they're WIIFM. What's in it for them? Because if we understand what motivates that customer, then we can understand how they gauge success in these types of decisions that they make. And when we insert anxiety in a situation, we also need to predict the response from that prospect so that we can effectively manage the conversations. Typically, humans, when you insert or are faced with some sort of anxiety, you want to have a flight or fight approach. So with your customer, with that prospect that you're dealing with, which will it be? And that will prepare you, once you've asked that question, how to manage that conversation going forward. So for most of us in the field of sales, an anxiety question that we may see is, what is the impact of not meeting your target this year? You mean right off the bat, that's one of those questions that, gets you to start thinking, hang on, really, what happens if I don't meet the target this year? Or do you feel confident, based on the numbers today, that you are on track to meet the target this year? So, if I'm in the business of looking at sales automation software, that may be one of the things I may say is, do you feel confident that you have the data and the access to information that you need to help you make the numbers this year? And that, again, is creating that sense there's an outcome that, I know that you want to get to. You want to make those targets. You want to blow those targets away. So I'm trying to create a sense of urgency with you by asking those questions. Are we really on track for meeting that? I'm sure some of us are on the receiving end of some of these anxiety questions on our sales calls each week with the rest of our teams. So with that, how many of us today are using anxiety questions? And, even whether or not you were familiar with the concept of anxiety questions before or knew what they were called, how many of us are using those questions today? And in a moment, you should see, bear with me a second, I think our slides are having a field at the moment. You should see a button that pops up asking you to enter a yes, no. There we are. Sorry about that. There is a button that asks you to enter yes or no as to whether or not you're using anxiety questions today. So go ahead, just click on the screen to enter whether or not you're using it in some shape, size, or form. As in some of our workshops, when we get to the point of anxiety questions in our role-playing exercises, what's very interesting to me is how many people are prepared with an anxiety question and are very keen to answer anxiety questions or to use anxiety questions. So I'm curious to see how many of us may be using those questions today. That's quite interesting. Almost two-thirds of you are using anxiety questions today, so that's quite interesting. So for the others of us, as we go through the rest of the slides, hopefully we can motivate you to look at using anxiety questions. So in looking at how we create an anxiety question, I know this is a very long slide, but bear with me as we walk through it together. One of the first things that we want to do is we want to think of a feature that our product has or a service has and a capability that it enables. So what do I mean by that? So say we're selling, air conditioning solutions. And one of the capabilities of our air conditioning solutions is that it's energy efficient. Okay? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to relate that capability to a difficulty that the prospect is facing or would like to avoid. So for example, I'm talking to a prospect and selling my air conditioning solutions and understanding that a key capability is energy efficiency, but I also know that they have a key mandate to reduce costs, to reduce operational expenses. So one of the things I might want to do is I might want to say, I understand that you're under pressure to control costs. Have you thought about using a more energy efficient ventilation system to help you reduce your power costs? And right away, what that does is that creates for the customer a very clear picture of how what I'm selling can directly help to resolve a key issue that they're facing. So the way that I worded that question was, have you considered some of the other ways that we can use it, or thinking about, have you ever wondered how to improve those costs by, using this type of a solution? I understand you're under pressure to control costs. Have you thought of a way of, this way of looking at that? So what that then does is it creates that sense of anxiety in the customer that, hold on, this is an issue that I could be resolving if I were able to explore that solution or look at that solution. And it also creates a sense of urgency because I could take it a step further to say, what would, if you're able to save 20% on your energy bills today, what would that look like? And, what could you do with those funds? Now, can you risk waiting another 3 or 4 months to see that type of savings on your energy bill? So these are the types of ways that we use anxiety questions to really create a sense of urgency and a motivation to move forward. One of the things that we want to make sure that we do is we want to follow up that anxiety question with a positive response. Because, again, we don't want it to be a confrontational situation. We want to encourage them that we're here to support and help them resolve that issue, not just to create fear and panic. So, we would follow up an anxiety question with we've got some experience in this area. Can we talk about how we can, how you're dealing with this today? So again, that creates a positive turn on it. So you're not just creating that anxiety, but you're also providing a way of addressing that, issue or helping with that issue. So as we look at anxiety questions, there are a few test points to judge whether or not those questions are true anxiety questions. And, one of the obvious ones is, does it cause anxiety? But does it cause anxiety or is it insulting? So sometimes I've heard sales reps ask questions, and sometimes in that sense of urgency and frustration when you want to move a deal forward, you get to the point where, well, isn't it just plain silly not to move forward on this right now? Or don't you think you'll look like an idiot if you haven't, made a decision on this within the next week? We want to be very careful because what we risk doing with that is we risk insulting the customer. And then that just has the opposite effect of what we're trying to do. Because obviously we won't motivate anyone to take action if we're insulting if we're insulting the customer. The next thing that we want to do is use the anxiety question to get that prospect to think about the future. So pointing out something that happened in the past, so you knew that particular company made some, had some key failures in the past, and you know there are things you can help with. But rather than pointing out the failures, what we want to do is really look to the future to motivate them to take actions now that can help them, address or improve their future success. So again, the question is really gauged to get them to think about a future outcome and create some anxiety as to how they can get to that future outcome or avoid an issue by using our solutions. And the third test point of an anxiety question is whether or not it risks rapport. But the first real question here is, do we have rapport with that prospect that we're talking to today? Are we in a position where we have the kind of conversation, or we can have the kind of conversation to insert an anxiety question? What you want to do is you want to insert the question in a way that it gets the person to think that, that's actually a good point. Yes, it's making me a bit anxious about what you're saying, but that's a good point. And, maybe that's something I need to think about, versus having them think, how rude and abrasive can you be by raising some of these questions. So again, we want to be very careful as to how we word them and how we, bring across those questions with our prospect. So in a recent workshop that I was doing, I had a director of sales in the audience, and he said to me, his eyes lit up on the topic of anxiety question, and he said to me, I think you've worked, and he named another company. I said, I think you've done some work with that company. And I said, why? He said, well, I had a visit from a sales rep from that company, and I didn't recognize it at the time, but now that we're going through it, they asked me a brilliant anxiety question. And then he went through to explain the scenario. So he's in a family business, and the business has experienced some rough times in the last few years. They've been losing sales, customers have been leaving. So he took back the helm of the business to really transform the business and get it back on track. And in taking back the business, one of the things that he had to do was make some serious decisions about where to spend. And he looked at his marketing budget and decided, okay, there's one area I'm going to take funds away from because I need to refocus our marketing efforts in another area. And the area that he was looking to cut was an area called directory services. And, he had an annual contract for his company to be listed in an online and print directory service. And he thought, I really need to move these funds somewhere else. So he met with the sales rep from the directory services company, and he explained that, that he was very sorry. This is what was happening with the business, and he really needed to move on and focus his efforts somewhere else. So she listened to him, and then she said to him, aren't you concerned, though, that if you pull your presence from our listing services, the market may think that you're going out of business? And he said his first reaction was to ask her to invite her to leave his office and not to knock on his doorstep again. But then he took a few deep breaths, and he thought about it, and he said to her, do you really think that could be the perception in the marketplace, that if I'm not listed in a directory service, that people think I'm going out of business? And she shared with her some real-life examples of where that's happened based on her experience. And what ended up happening is by asking that one anxiety question, she actually forced him to think of the implications of what he was doing and where he was putting those funds. And at the end of that conversation, not only did he renew the contract with her, but he also ended up buying more services from her. So I thought that was quite a brilliant use of an anxiety question. And as we look at, how anxiety questions should be couched and how they should be raised, one of the things we want to ensure, again, is that they're not confrontational, but instead they're educational or instructional. We really want to be adding value to our customers. So at the end of the day, with the anxiety question, rather than criticizing or, being the bringer of woe and bad tidings, what we want to do is raise a concern, but raise it in a way to demonstrate that we also have a solution or a way of helping them address that issue. So again, we're also bringing some knowledge and expertise to the table. We're not just creating panic. And we also want to ensure that our anxiety questions are respectful, because we really will gain nothing from raising it in such a way that comes across as condescending or insults the buyer's intelligence at the end of the day. So when do we use an anxiety question? Do we always need an anxiety question? Sometimes, and again, referencing some of the workshops we've done, I chuckle because some of our sales folks are so keen to have anxiety questions, and I've seen some of the role-play exercises we've done where after the interaction, they say, oh, I forgot to use the anxiety question. And that brings us to the point, when do we use an anxiety question? Sometimes clients are well aware of their need to change, and they're well aware of the solutions that we bring to the table and how they can help. And to ask an anxiety question at that juncture may not yield any incremental benefit. In fact, it might even jeopardize our process. But in the cases where the prospect is not on the same page as us, and we believe we're really at risk that they may not understand or fully see the impact of our solutions, then a well-placed anxiety question can really help us to change their thought process. So in looking at some of the scenarios where we use an anxiety question, there are really three key areas. one of the first areas is to help a prospect uncover additional problems or to raise additional problems that the prospect may not have been thinking of today. So in a scenario, it could be that the prospect is just not seeing these problems the same way we are, or maybe that they're at a stage in their business where they're going through new growth or entering a new area that they're not experienced with this particular area, and there's some potential problems that they may be facing that they may not be able to see. But based on our experience and our expertise, we can raise that with them. And a good example of this is in the area of, regulatory compliance. So a few years ago, there was a new bit of regulation that was introduced to the financial sector called FATCA. And what that really required was that banks around the globe were required to communicate back to the U.S. government information on deposits, on banking deposits or accounts that U.S. citizens had abroad, wherever they were. And that had serious implications for those financial institutions. So asking a question around whether or not they are prepared with the appropriate software and processes to provide that amount of information back, as to comply with the regulation, would be a way of creating some amount of anxiety and raising potential problems for an area that they may not have been experienced with before, or an area that's new for them. Another place to use an anxiety question is in the area of disrupting the client's vision of the solution. So we may have a situation where we're engaging with a prospect, and their view of the situation may not necessarily be aligned to our capabilities. So what we want to do here is ask some good questions that help the prospect to see that, there's another way of doing that that's just more aligned to what value we can bring. So, for example, you may have a prospect that's looking at, doing outsourcing. That may be their view of the solution. The only way to solve this particular problem is by outsourcing. But you may be selling a particular bit of software, or, you may have a certain skill set or service that you can bring to the table that might allow them to solve that problem in a different way rather than outsourcing. So what you're doing is you're presenting a different view to the prospect of how they may be able to solve their issues, but just slightly looking at a slightly different solution. So again, what you're doing here is you're disrupting the client's vision of the solution. And the third area that we may use an anxiety question is really to create a sense of urgency where none seems to exist today. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get the customer to think about, okay, can we wait? And this is usually before we make a decision on this particular topic. And usually these are tied up to issues of either lost revenues or excessive costs. So going back to the point, the example we used earlier about selling that, ventilation solution, if they're able to save 20% on their energy bill now, can they wait 6 months to make that decision? So what you want to do, again, is create in very clear terms that sense of urgency by tying a benefit or, a cost savings to it that they can realize sooner by taking action now rather than delaying that action until later where they may not see that benefit until a later date. And it's so important, again, that we ask very good, well-placed questions here to create that sense of anxiety around, can we really wait or delay making this decision? Because what you want them to see is that with your solution, this is now an imperative. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have, because if I put this in place today, it's going to allow me to save this amount of money, or it's going to help me to get closer to meeting gaining additional revenues. So we talked about earlier, we get to that point in a sales cycle where there's just silence. So you've had great engagement, you've met with various stakeholders in the process. You feel that they understand the solutions you bring to the table, and then all of a sudden, all is going well, and there's no response. There's no communication. You're trying to get the next meeting to understand, okay, when are we going to move this forward? When are they going to place the order? When are we, what happens next? But no response. So there's that radio silence period. So what are some of the things that we can do to help us move that engagement along or keep that engagement going throughout the entire sales cycle? Because once that communication stops, what happens is that limits our ability to predict when and how the prospect will buy. And that also has implications for forecast accuracy. So, that deal that we forecasted and we thought was coming in at the end of the month, guess what? It starts slipping. And we know how folks don't like when our forecast dates start slipping. So what are some of the key things that we can do to maintain engagement throughout the sales cycle and reduce those periods of silence, or almost eliminate those periods of silence? The first thing, or probably one of the most important things that we can do, is to prepare for every interaction, whether it be a call, a physical meeting, a conversation. We need to carefully prepare for that interaction so that we're not wasting our prospects or clients' time. We need to be prepared by understanding what's really going on. What are the key issues that they're facing? What are the key problems that they need to resolve? And how can we help them do that? Because if we're not using that limited time that we have wisely, then we risk just not getting time on their calendars for the next meeting. So we have to make sure that ahead of time that we're well prepared to articulate and to have conversations that are meaningful to that prospect. The second thing that we want to do to maintain engagement is really to focus. So we have their time, we have their audience. How do we ensure that we're really focusing on their needs and wants, not just what we've got to sell or what we've got to make our quota on, but focus on how we can help them solve their problems and couch our solutions in the context of what's important to them at the end of the day. So it's not just about showing up and telling them all the wonderful things that we can do with our solution, but how's it going to impact some real issues that they're having today so that they can understand how our solution fits within their context. The third thing, or third way of maintaining engagement, is to ensure that we're listening actively. And not just, sometimes we're hearing, so we've heard what they said, but we haven't actually listened. And more importantly, we haven't actually listened to hear what they're not saying. So what we want to do is make sure that when we're engaging with that prospect, we're fully understanding what they're saying and we're understanding what their needs are. And sometimes we're so keen to move on to the next point or to say the next point that rather than really listening to what that prospect is saying, we're preparing to speak. And when we're preparing to speak, we're not really hearing some of the key things that we need to be hearing that could help us move that engagement forward. The fourth point that's key for maintaining engagement is to ensure that after you have that meeting or that engagement, never leave without scheduling the next meeting. And it seems like a very simple thing to do, but it's very powerful because what that starts to do then is it starts to create that continuum for how we move this sale forward or how we move this opportunity forward. So, you've had a great meeting. Okay, can we schedule a follow-up, tomorrow or next week to see where we are with these action items that we need to deliver? And it's also about the things that you need to get back to that prospect on, but in addition to that, what they need to get done as well. So you're creating a continuum of activity to ensure that, okay, we have a next step and we have that next step scheduled. Because the risk is if you leave that meeting and you haven't scheduled that next step, then it may be difficult for you to get that next meeting and then you become lower priority. So if we schedule that ahead of time, you're already on the calendar. Not to say that things can't change and you can't be rescheduled, but you're already there and chances are then you will have that next step. And the last tactic that we can use to maintain engagement is really to start by creating a timeline with the customer, by beginning with that first meeting and going all the way through to the end of what the customer wants to realize, how we're going to solve that particular issue they have. So what we're trying to do is start building out that timeline. So if they're expecting a desired result at the end of, the beginning of January next year, for example, when do they need to have your solution in place in order to see that result in January? And start working backwards, start working that timeline. So if you need a certain amount of time to get that solution to them, then they need to give you a PO by October. That's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to create that timeline, build that out so they can understand if I want that end result or end benefit from your solution at this time, then this is when I need to move forward, or these are the things I need to do before in order to move forward. So just some key things that we want to think about as to how we, reduce that radio silence and keep the communication going so that we can move the engagement forward. So this is an example of an anxiety question. This is actually based on a true scenario. Years ago, and some of you may recognize Steve Jobs in his very youthful form, when Steve Jobs was in his first iteration at Apple, and Apple is not what it is today, but it was very much it's starting up as a new entrant in the market, had some formidable competition from IBM and some of the other players. Steve Jobs was trying to recruit some very key executives, and one of those people that he approached was John Sculley from Pepsi at the time. And later it was said by Sculley that what really made him change his mind and decide to move to Apple was the question that Steve Jobs asked him, which is, do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world? And, looking at that, that was just such a brilliant anxiety question, and I thought we'd share that with you. And it's really a testament to the power of an effective question. And again, we have that ability in our arsenal to ask very good questions. As we look at the rest of the year and how we move forward, how do we take some time to deliberately craft some good questions that can help our customers to move forward? And on a more entertaining note, this is probably one of the most, I would consider one of the most brilliant anxiety questions in the movie domain. And, of course, most of you have been familiar with Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry, right? And, you've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? And obviously I'll defer to Eastwood on his capabilities to ask that in a much better way than I can. But I thought I'd leave you with that question at the end of our session. So to summarize some of the key points that we've looked at today, so anxiety questions are really designed to get our prospects to think about the consequences of not having our solution or service, and really to, again, create that sense of urgency to help them move forward by understanding this is the benefit they can get from our solution, and this is why they need to move forward, by creating that sense of anxiety about an outcome. Secondly, follow up an anxiety question with a positive response. Again, we don't want to be fear-mongering. We don't want to be creating that sense of woe and dread. What we want to do, yes, is create anxiety, but also demonstrate how we're here to help, how we're here to help them, mitigate an event or avoid an outcome by using our solutions. And lastly, use anxiety questions in 3 key areas. 1, to uncover additional problems, problems that the prospect may not be seeing today. 2, to disrupt their view of the solution. If they're aligned or they're thinking of a competitive solution, how can we, use a well-placed anxiety question to get them to consider our capabilities? And thirdly, again, to create urgency. Because, at the end of the day, what we want to do is motivate that prospect to take action with us. To get us closer to closing out the year strong and meeting those goals that we need to meet for the end of the year. So with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'd like to open it up for any questions that you may have. Feel free to enter them in the Q&A box and let us know how things, any questions, what thoughts are on your mind with regards to anxiety questions. I see a couple of interesting ones coming up. One is, again, where is there not a good time? When is there not a good time to use an anxiety question? Well, if you're moving along with the prospect and you're having good discourse and you understand their business issues and they understand how you're positioned to solve their issues, then there's probably no need at that point to introduce any fear or any anxiety into the equation, because that could actually jeopardize the process rather than helping the process. So, however, again, if we've seen a point in the sales cycle where things are not going as we'd like them to go, and we think there's risk that prospect is not seeing us in a way that, or seeing our capabilities in a way that could help them, that's where you want to ask those anxiety questions. So, we have to gauge the situation very carefully as to how we ask those questions. Another scenario, another question that's come up is, at what stage in the relationship do we ask that anxiety question? Well, you want to ask those questions where you're actually, you have some rapport. So a good place to not ask the question is when it's the first meeting with that prospect. You've never met that person before. Starting out with an anxiety question is probably not a good way to start off. So you want to make sure that when you're asking or injecting that anxiety question, there's some amount of rapport that's been there before. And you've thought through, again, what those consequences were, maybe for us when you ask that anxiety question. So if I wasn't able to get to your questions today, please keep them coming. I see there are a few others here. Please keep them coming. I will actually follow up directly with you with a response. And again, thank you so much for your time. Today's session will be on our website, available for download later in a couple hours' time, in a few hours' time. You'll be able to see it on valueselling.com/resources and webinars. And also, at the same time, please feel free to visit our e-store. We've got a host of information and resources on our e-store, so please feel free to visit and take a look at some of the things that we've got to offer. Our next webinar is scheduled for October the 6th, and it's titled Conquer the No Decision Black Hole. So please feel free. And then we also have another webinar scheduled for October 20th as well. So please look out for the reminders for those, and we hope you'll be able to join us in our future webinars. And please feel free again. We're on YouTube, the social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Please feel free to follow us, engage with us. And again, thank you so much for listening. Feel free to reach out to me as well. If after this session you have any questions, again, that we weren't able to get to, please don't hesitate, reach out, and I will follow up with you with a direct response. Again, thank you again for joining us today. Have a good rest of the afternoon.